Our program is Mahoning Valley's Automotive History. And I'm very pleased to introduce Vince Guerrieri, who will be our presenter. Vince is a Youngstown native, and it's a town he's left without really escaping. He graduated from Cheney High School and spent his summers home from Bowling Green University working at the Tribune Chronicle in Warren. He's an award-winning journalist who's worked in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Northwest Ohio, and his work has appeared in Politico, Ohio Magazine, Smithsonian.com, and Jalopnik. He's written books on Ohio sports and contributed to 2 anthologies, including the Youngstown one, Car Bombs to Cookie Tables, which was put out by Belt Publications. So, very happy to give you Vince Guerrieri.
I'm tall, but I'm not as tall as Bill. Thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here, and it's actually a really good day for me. Bill listed off some of the people I've written for, and as of today, that list includes, I'm sorry, not enough? Okay, this is the first time that anybody's told me that I'm not loud enough. This one. Switch off the mic. You're good to go. Hey, I'm back. Is this to everybody's liking? Marvelous, marvelous. As I was saying, the list of publications that I've contributed to increased today, actually. I have a story out on Popular Mechanics website about the 50th anniversary of the last fire on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. I am here to talk to you about automotive history, specifically in the Mahoning Valley. Obviously, that picture is, I'm sure, a very familiar one to everybody. That's an aerial photo of the Lordstown General Motors plant. And while that's been in the news a lot lately, for unfortunate reasons, the automotive history in the area goes far beyond that, and I think is absolutely a fascinating one. And a lot of car-related stories were imparted to me by that guy. That's my grandfather. He was a car guy, owned a car dealership for a hot minute, and he's probably had the biggest influence of anybody outside of my parents on my life. So I hope you appreciate this, and like I said, this presentation is as much his as it is mine. Auto history goes back, we think of it as a 20th century invention, but auto history goes back really to the days when Ohio was a wilderness and the United States wasn't even a country. To 1770, in fact, when Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, French guy, came up with the first, what is regarded as an auto, personal vehicle that transports you by means other than horses or your own power. And what he did is he put a steam boiler on what was essentially a wagon, and he used that. And this is actually a replica that was built by engineering students in France. I saw it a few years ago at a car show at Stan Hewitt in Akron. So steam power was obviously being harnessed at that point for a variety of sources. It was used in trains, and it was really used in the auto industry until let's say the 19-teens, even into the 1920s. As you might imagine, a steam-powered car was fraught with its own peril because it was essentially a giant boiler that you had to keep at just the right temperature. You always ran the risk of burns or even a boiler explosion. So clearly there had to be a better way to get around. In 1886, Carl Benz of Germany filed a patent for what was called a gas-powered engine that he was able to put on the back of a buggy. It was a very small engine. It was actually not the first one to apply for a patent, but he was the first one to get it. We'll get to that in a minute. At that point, gasoline was nothing but a byproduct in oil refining. When oil was refined in the late 1800s, it was turned into kerosene or paraffin for home heating and home lighting at that point. This was before the incandescent light bulb. In fact, I mentioned the story I was doing for Popular Mechanics. I need to get close to the mic. All right, am I better now? The story for Popular Mechanics talks about the pollution in the Cuyahoga River, and a lot of it came from the oil refineries that dotted the riverbanks, and they didn't know what to do with the gasoline, and they would just dump it in the river. And one of the biggest guilty parties in this, as I mentioned here, is John D. Rockefeller, who opened up his first oil refinery on the Cuyahoga in 1863 and obviously incorporated Standard Oil in Cleveland in 1870. And the reason that he was able to do this is because the first big oil deposits that were found in the United States were found in western Pennsylvania, Oil City, Drakeswell, that particular corner of the universe, and they could be shipped very easily to Cleveland because it was a city that was accessible by railroads and the lake and the Cuyahoga River. The rise of the internal combustion engine and autos happened to coincide with when Rockefeller's business was starting to ebb, because obviously Thomas Edison came up with the incandescent light bulb, and people didn't need kerosene or paraffin for lighting things like they did once before. Standard Oil grew to become the largest corporation in America, to the point where the government stepped in and prosecuted it as a trust, as a monopoly. And it was broken up into a multitude of companies, and if you've done any traveling and had to fill up your car, you've seen more than a few of them: Ohio, Exxon Mobil, Amoco, and Marathon. Electricity was also used to power cars even 100 years ago, even more than 100 years ago, once Edison had kind of figured out how to harness it for a light bulb. The problem with electric cars is the same problem with electric cars today. You know, how far can you go on one charge, and where do you go to recharge your batteries? This car is a Baker Electric. Baker was another Cleveland-based auto manufacturer. And this was in the White House garage. It was used by 5 first ladies in succession. Mrs. Taft, Woodrow Wilson had 2 wives, and they both used that. Florence Harding used it, and Mrs. Coolidge as well. Electric cars were very popular, particularly with women, because electric cars had electric starters. And up until about 1912 or 1913, gas-powered cars did not have self-starters. If you've ever seen an old Model T, they were started with a crank in the front. And the problem with that is, if a car backfired while you were starting it, the crank would come back to you and break your hand. And it happened often enough that doctors even had a name for it. They called it the chauffeur's fracture, or later on they called it the Ford fracture, because Henry Ford was the last guy to have a crank on a mass-produced car. The Model Ts, I believe, had a crank on them up until they quit making them in 1928. I mentioned Baker Electric. If you've ever been on the east side of Cleveland, headed out toward the Cleveland Clinic on Euclid Avenue, that is the old Baker Electric showroom at the corner of Euclid and East 71st. Picture on top is when it was Baker. The picture on the bottom was taken recently. It was subject to a multi-million-dollar renovation, but the reason that they had it on Euclid Avenue is because at that point it was regarded as Millionaire's Row, not just in the city, but in the country. The guys that things are named for in Cleveland lived on Euclid Avenue. Rockefeller lived there, Jephthah Wade lived there, the Severances lived there. Basically anybody who was of means was there, and unfortunately a lot of that has been torn down. The Cleveland Children's Museum is still is in one of those old houses, and obviously you have buildings like this, but a lot of them have gone the way of all flesh. Gradually, a lot of companies saw autos as a way to make some money, and they came from a lot of backgrounds to make them. This car here is a white, another model made in Cleveland from a company that you might have heard of because of their sewing machines. But White Auto lasted, the name lasted up until the I want to say the 1990s. They made trucks for a while. They were a nameplate that had been bought by Volvo, but it didn't matter where you came from, but a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds decided they wanted to start making cars. Like I said up here, Studebaker was a wagon maker that dated back to the days before the Civil War. Pierce Arrow made bird cages and then made bicycles. Elmore, which is a car company that existed briefly in Northwest Ohio, was also a bicycle manufacturer. And a lot of carriage makers decided to get into automaking. They were already making the conveyance. All they had to do was drop an engine into it. And that is kind of how we got into the auto industry here in the Mahoning Valley. The first car built in Ohio is believed to have been built in Youngstown. That is the Dr. Carlos Booth was a doctor. He was from Phelps Street, and he went to Fredonia Carriage Manufacturing. And Fredonia, as near as I can tell, it was on Market Street, almost to where the Market Street Bridge is now, where the federal courthouse is. And they made the carriage, and they went to an engine company, the Pierce Crouch Engine Company of New Brighton, Pennsylvania, just over the state line in Beaver County. And they supplied the engine and put it in the vehicle. Dr. Crouch was looking for something that was not horse-drawn. He had a couple of terrible experiences with horses. One dragged his wife almost to her death, and another one, kind of got spooked and ran in front of a train and killed a couple of members of his family because they were in the carriage the horse was pulling. But he only used this for a couple of years. He actually entered it into a race. And auto races then are not like we know them now. Auto races at the time were a test of endurance and not necessarily of speed. And endurance was kind of an issue with a lot of old cars, in part because it was experimental technology and in part because it was very hard to drive them. In fact, there's a quote here from Dr. Booth. He believes in electricity for level cities and gasoline for hilly places. We take paved roads for granted now, but that was not the case in 1897. Ultimately, he went back to using a horse and buggy because he had more terrible run-ins with horses while he was in a car. Apparently, it would spook them and they'd start running in front of his car and things like that. But he kind of helped give rise to the concept of a doctor's coupe. Cars in the early 20th century were sold as conveyances to help you do your job. And that was one of the selling points for doctors. Henry Ford had an all-enclosed coupe that seated two people, and it was called a doctor's coupe, and that kind of gave way to the businessman's coupe that you would see. In fact, you can probably see some car shows today. That lasted up until pretty much the post-World War II era. I mentioned Fredonia Carriage Company. They also started making their own autos as well. It was a very hit or miss proposition at that point, especially because in the years before Henry Ford started making the Model T, the idea that everybody could own a car was science fiction. These were things that were made at great expense for people who were at the very least middle class who could afford them. And at that point you still had populations that were, at least in urban areas, that were clustered around the city center, relying on public transportation or their own 2 feet to get to wherever they needed to get. And Fredonia had a brief life, made cars up until 1904. They filed for bankruptcy that year, and then the factories caught fire a couple of years after that, and that was one of a litany of auto companies that existed very briefly in the Youngstown area, Youngstown-Warren area, including the Mahoning. I didn't list it up there, but there was one called the Glenwood. There's the Trumbull and the Pendleton in Warren as well. The Wick family decided to try and get into the auto industry at that point as well. The Wicks, obviously, they were very important because, well, there are a lot of things around that are still named for them. They were very prominent in the city as bankers and investors. They helped provide the seed money for Youngstown Sheet and Tube, among other things, and served, and members of the family served as officers in that company fairly early on. In fact, one of them was George Wick, and I know a couple of months ago the Bites and Bits presentation was on the Titanic, and he was actually vacationing in England after he had taken a vacation from his time at Sheet and Tube and booked passage back on the Titanic, and his family made it back, but he didn't. But the Wick family made the Blue Goose. It was a prototype, and it was state of the art. It was very posh. It was something to see based on news coverage of the day. Unfortunately, it appears to be lost to history. The prototype cost about $15,000 in the early 1900s, although they estimated that once they got it into production, they could probably cut costs down to about $8,000. It was called the Blue Goose because it had this beautiful coat of royal blue paint, leather interior, enormous car, 7-foot 6-inch wheelbase, and the wheelbase is the length of the car between this hubcap and this hubcap. Weighed 3,100 pounds, which is kind of astonishing when you consider that the body was made of aluminum, which is typically lighter than steel. It was very good on performance. It had a 4-cylinder engine and could go up to 40 miles an hour, which again doesn't seem like that big a deal now, but you know, when cars were winning races going 12 and 15 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour sounds incredible. They took it to all the major auto shows in Chicago and Cleveland and New York, but you know, they couldn't make a deal to put it into production. And like I said, it appears that it's been lost to history. It was sold to the Stearns Company, which existed in Cleveland up until about the 1930s. And unfortunately, a lot of those cars from that era were kind of destroyed or left with great indifference. If you've ever been to Cleveland, there's a fantastic auto collection at the Western Reserve Historical Society, the Crawford Collection, and that collection started because Fred Crawford saw a lot of cars at the Cleveland Great Lakes Exposition in the 1930s, cars that dated back to this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he was told that that the World's Fair was over and they were just going to throw them all out. And he said, "I will take them." And that was the start of that collection. And if you ever get a chance to visit it, it is an amazing collection. And I drew a lot of research on for this presentation from their archives as well. For the first 15 years of the auto industry, the Selden patent kind of ruled. Remember when I said that Benz was the first to get a patent but wasn't the first to apply for it? Selden was. He applied, he was a lawyer, he applied for the patent in 1879. Various amendments and addenda and things like that meant that the patent was not granted until 1896, but once it was, he had the ability to license automakers. And in fact, if you've ever seen any a lot of old auto ads, at the very bottom it says licensed through the Selden patent or members of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association. And that was the association that essentially worked with Selden to get the patent. Obviously, it seems like the idea that you could patent an internal combustion engine seemed a little crazy. And they got to a point where Henry Ford said, "No, I'm not going to pay you." And Henry Ford told him to go pound salt. And if you know anything about Henry Ford, he did that a lot throughout his life to a variety of people. And eventually a judge agreed, and the patent was struck down. But for 15 years, George Selden collected what was estimated to be hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties from this patent, but never actually built a car. The most famous auto with roots in the Mahoning Valley is probably Packard, and it starts with James Packard, who bought a Winton. And Winton was a car manufacturer in the Cleveland area. This is Alexander Winton himself driving the car. And this guy riding in the back seat is Tom Johnson, who was the mayor of Cleveland throughout most of the first decade of the 20th century. In fact, if you've ever been to Public Square, there's a big statue of him sitting in a chair. James Packard bought a Winton and had a variety of problems when he drove it home. And he ended up in correspondence with the car company. And he was an engineer, so he knew what he was talking about. And the car company was just fed up hearing from him. And they essentially said, hey, if you can build a better car, why aren't you? Which is the wrong thing to say to an engineer, because he did. And so he and his brother built the first Packard in Warren in 1899. The company existed for 60 years, actually outlasted Winton, which gave up the ghost in the 1920s. And they were hemmed in their location in Warren, and they were looking for investors, and they were looking for space to expand. And luckily, they crossed paths with a guy by the name of Henry B. Joy. And Joy was just fascinated by this car. He actually watched a Packard chase down a fire engine on the street of New York City, and reliability was a key selling point of cars in the early 20th century because it was very difficult to be a reliable vehicle in the 20th century. So he went to the Packard brothers and kind of bought in, and eventually eventually the auto company moved to Detroit, where it remained pretty much until its end. And if you spend any time looking at the news out of Detroit, the Packard Plant is still one of those great big buildings that nobody's really figured out what to do with. It was like, if you're my age, what the Idora Park Ballroom was. People would just go and go in when it was closed and walk around to see what they could see. But it was kind of more of a dangerous proposition, at the Packard Plant. And there's been some environmental abatement, but it's one of those buildings that to this day is just sitting there. Packard moved to Detroit, and Detroit really became the center for the auto industry. And that happened because of a variety of reasons. Obviously, you had guys like Ransom Olds and Henry Ford who were continuing to innovate and quite honestly moved from company to company. Ransom Olds did the Oldsmobile, and then after that he did the Rio, R-E-O, that taken from his initials. What we now know as the Ford Motor Company was the third company that Henry Ford had actually started. Detroit at that point was already a major metropolis with a lot of people who could work in auto factories, and they had access to, through the lakefront and through railroad service, to raw materials like timber that could be found in Michigan, and iron that could be seen in the Upper Peninsula and up into Minnesota. And companies kind of formed, and then one by one they all kind of ate each other. And a real good example of that is obviously the formation of General Motors, and that is Alfred P Sloan, who was the president of General Motors in the 1920s and 1930s. And he advocated a car for every purse and purpose. If you remember how General Motors used to be, they obviously had Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Pontiac. And I bring that up because Pontiac actually started out as an offshoot of another model, the Oakland. And it proved to be more popular than the Oakland, so they made it. And they eventually shut Oakland down. But Oakland lives on here because of the Oakland Center for the Arts, which took its name from its first home, which was in a building that housed an Oakland dealership. Cleveland also became an automaking hub, and part of that was for a lot of the same reasons that Detroit did, because it was near a lakefront, and there was a river, and there were great access to railroads, so you could transport a lot, near access to a lot of people who could work there, And there were a variety of auto manufacturers, many of which served the higher end of the auto market. And I included this advertisement here for Jordan Autos. I wrote a story for Ohio Magazine a couple of years ago about this. But this was a Cleveland company, and the guy that ran the company, its namesake, Ned Jordan, was not a car guy. He was a words guy. He worked in newspapers for a while. He worked in advertising for a while. But he invented what is pretty much what we know as the modern car ad. Up until the 1920s, they would say, this is the car, this is what it costs, this is what kind of engine it has, this is where you go and buy one. Jordan sold an image. He sold a car called the Jordan Friendly 3. That it was a roadster that seated 2 people, 3 if they're friendly. And this is the Jordan Playboy. And if you'll notice, the words have nothing to do with the technical specifications of the car. The words have nothing to do with how much it costs, what a value it is, how reliable it is. It's selling a story. And we've kind of had car ads to that effect ever since. Unfortunately, Jordan and a lot of other auto companies, specifically in Cleveland, but in general, gave up the ghost in the Great Depression. It was a tough time for everybody. And then, the Great Depression was followed by World War II, when the auto companies that did survive were not producing autos for civilian transportation. There is no model year American cars from 1943, 1944, and 1945 because everything was going to the war effort. Obviously, Willis built Jeeps, Ford built bombers, Packard built engines for airplanes and PT boats, so everybody was kind of geared up for the war effort. But the war ended, and that set the stage for an auto boom after World War II. People were more than willing. They had the disposable income to buy things. Companies were itching to create new products and sell things. And what happened was a lot of auto companies were able to make a go of it. That was kind of the last gasp for a lot of independent automakers, just because there were people that were willing to buy just about anything. But the auto industry was at a point where it needed to change as well, because a lot of the factories that they had at that point dated back to their early days in the early 20th century. And a lot of them are on multiple floor buildings, which is not particularly efficient. And that's why you saw massive expansion of the auto industry in states like Ohio, because they had the space to do it. This, I thought, was a really cool picture. This is the structural steel being put up for the Lordstown plant. I believe it was 1965. The idea for the Lordstown plant went back to the 50s. They were starting to talk about that. Apparently there was also an idea to put a Ford plant in the Mahoning Valley in the 1950s. That was mentioned by George Rice, the former business editor of the Vindicator. It's one of those things that seems kind of nebulous, and you're not sure how much of that is fact and how much of that is myth. But General Motors ended up coming in the 1960s, and a lot of that is due to the overtures of James Rhodes, who was the governor of Ohio in the 60s and then again in the 70s. But he acquired a reputation as a smokestack chaser. He wanted people to relocate their factories in the state of Ohio. And in fact, he actually had a bunch of political and business leaders to kind of go out and tout the state as a place to relocate. They were called Rhodes Raiders. But Rhodes also, he kind of laid the groundwork for expansion for a bunch of General Motors plants in northern Ohio. Obviously, the development of the General Motors plant at Lordstown. And in the 70s, he was the guy who essentially brought Honda to Marysville. 1966, the first car, a Chevy Impala, rolls off the line at Lordstown. And Chevy, and early on, Lordstown built bigger cars. Not just bigger cars, they built sports cars. They built sports cars like this red Pontiac Firebird, which I guess technically is a pony car. The muscle cars was basically an idea that stemmed in no small part from John DeLorean, who headed the Pontiac division of General Motors, who said, what would happen if we put a great big engine in just some run-of-the-mill Pontiac Tempest? And that's how the GTO was born. And you know, it turned into an arms race. And at the same time, you saw the development of the pony car, which was, you know, a smaller version, maybe a little more economical, very sportily designed, performance-oriented. Pony car, of course, the first one would be the Ford Mustang. And it also included the Firebird and the Camaro. This Firebird is the first one off the line at Lordstown. It and the second one, which is a gray coupe, are currently for sale on eBay. It's yours out the door, $285,000. The 60s also saw the rise of what was called the personal luxury car. People at that point, it wasn't really until after World War II that people started having multiple cars in a family. You know, you had people who were buying two cars, one for him and one for her, and then maybe another one for Junior when he got his driver's license as well. But the personal luxury car is a fairly well-appointed, usually a coupe that was used for almost status-oriented. They kind of trace it back to the Thunderbird, which was initially a two-seater, and it kind of limped along, and then they switched it to a four-seater, and that's how it remained for pretty much almost the rest of its existence. Sales skyrocketed, and they said, we may be onto something here. But there were many personal luxury cars. The Cadillac Eldorado was a real good example, as was the Studebaker Avanti. This is what's known as foreshadowing. But the 60s gave way to the 70s, and that's when people started to look into the possibility of smaller cars by necessity. Volkswagen introduced the Beetle in the United States in the early 50s, and American car companies tried to keep up with it, but they had to in the 1970s when a gas crisis started. And that's when Lordstown's fortunes were pretty much attached to smaller cars. I don't know if you guys watch Mad Men. I do, or I did. It's obviously no longer on the air, but there was a whole plot point throughout a couple of seasons where they tried to get a car contract, a car advertising contract, and it was for a model that was going to come out in the 70s, the XP887 from General Motors. And I said, gee, I bet that's something that they put in there on purpose. And so I looked up what the XP887 was, and it was the Chevrolet Vega, which was built for almost its entire existence at Lordstown. And it was a subcompact at the time. They were supposedly taking full advantage of all the available technology. It had a cast aluminum engine. It was drawn by computer-aided drafting. It was built with robots at Lordstown, and it seemed like it was very well received. It was actually the 1971 Motor Trend Car of the Year. Motor Trend later said, we'd like to take that one back. Almost immediately, problems arose. All things being equal, a larger car makes more profits for a company than a smaller one does. So a car like this was run with razor-thin margins, which meant they had to speed up production, which did not sit well with the workers on the line. Typically, the production levels were 60 cars an hour, and they said, we have to do 100 cars an hour, and that is a significant increase. As a result, there were all sorts of union grievances filed against General Motors, and in fact, it led to a Wildcat Strike in 1972 that was referred to in coverage at the time as an industrial Woodstock. It was such a groundbreaking event because these were the people who worked at Lordstown were not your typical auto workers. They were younger than average. They a lot of them had served in the armed forces in the Vietnam War, and they frankly weren't going to take it. Eventually, things were worked out between General Motors and the UAW, but there were still a lot of problems with the car. The rust proofing turned out to be not as good as it should have been. The engines that were cast aluminum with an iron head kept cracking or melting. There was all kinds of quality control issues. They sold 2 million of them in their 7-year run. And I got to thinking about this. You'd be hard pressed to see one on the road today still. It's one of those cars that's kind of fallen down the memory hole. But Lordstown has made small cars ever since. They went from the Vega to the Cavalier, and obviously to the after that to the Cobalt and the Cruise. In the 1980s, the city of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley was looking for whatever they could find. It was kind of a bleak time. I was a kid then, and even I realized it was a bleak time. And that's what led them to Avanti. Avanti was the last gasp of Studebaker. It was a personal luxury car. It's really a fascinating car. They made it out of fiberglass, which was state-of-the-art at the time. They made it out of fiberglass at a plant in Ashtabula. And they made it out of fiberglass because to make it out of metal would require months and months of retooling. And they wanted to push this into production in essentially 6 months because, they knew that the company was dying. It was designed by Raymond Lowy. He was a famous industrial designer. He designed the livery for Air Force One, which has been the same since the early 60s. He was responsible for the famous ad campaign in World War II. Lucky Strike Green has gone to war. And, he's done, you'd be hard pressed to say that you've never seen or touched anything that he's ever done. It was a cult car, and a couple of dealers who sold the car wanted to keep making it. And so they bought the tooling, and they kept making it in the Studebaker factory in South Bend. As I mentioned earlier, Studebaker started making wagons in the days of the Civil War. That's the same factory they were making it in. So there were obviously problems with trying to keep it going. And they also had quality control issues relating to paint and rust proofing as well. Went through a couple of owners, and it fell into the hands of a guy by the name of Mike Kelly in the 1980s. And Kelly was looking to expand. And like I said, Youngstown was looking for whatever it could find. So the mayor and some city council people and some Cafaros went and looked at it and said, we want in. The original plan was to build the sedan and the convertible because when Avanti was made by Studebaker, it was only made as a coupe. To build the sedan and the convertible in Youngstown, and then the next thing you know, they said we're closing down the factory in South Bend and building them all in Youngstown. And by building them all, I mean built another 405 models. It was beset with problems, but I wrote a story about this for Jalopnik a couple of months ago, and I talked to Mayor Ungaro, and he says, it got a lot farther than a lot of other ideas and plans that we tried to make. So it ended up, I went ahead. But J.J. Cafaro ended up buying out Mike Kelly, who went on to his next adventure, which apparently consisted of running a Ponzi scheme. And the only reason he did not die in prison is because he was diagnosed with cancer before he went to prison. Obviously, we had the Lordstown plant, and remember when I said that larger cars have larger profit margins? Well, since the 1990s, the big growth in the auto industry has been in sport utility vehicles because they are not legislated as cars, they are legislated as trucks. So they don't have to have the same fuel efficiency standards that a car does. And the current presidential administration has a marked indifference to any kind of escalation of fuel efficiency standards. So I like to tell people, I said, Donald Trump did not kill the Lordstown plant, but he certainly made the decision easier to do so. obviously with no real reason to make smaller cars anymore. And that's the thing, General Motors is getting out of the auto business in a significant way. They're making trucks, they're making vans, they're making SUVs. They dropped the Cruze, they dropped the Impala, they dropped the Malibu as well. The term that they use is unallocated, which is a way to get around labor contracts. They said, we're not closing the plant, we're just not giving you another car to make. And obviously that's kind of winding its way through the whole appeals process there. And as you've heard, there's an electric car company that has demonstrated some interest in the Lordstown plant, but I guess I don't have a real good answer for you on where we need to go from here. And that's pretty much my presentation. There is one thing I want to say. Bill had mentioned that I had written for Car Bombs to Cookie Tables. If you have it, I think they may still have some copies down in the gift shop, but if you have it and you liked it and you said, boy, I wish I could have been a part of this, or if you read what I wrote and said, this Guerrieri's a hack, I can do better than him, here's your chance. The second edition is going to come out in 2020. We are soliciting contributions. That email will, if you have a story or a story idea, the website can provide you further details, and I will happily entertain whatever questions you may have. Yes, please.
Is there an example of the Blue Goose anywhere still around?
To my knowledge, there is not. Unfortunately, there were all of these cars that just kind of came and went, and you know, everybody, for as much as everybody wants to complain about what a disposable society we live in now, it was just as disposable then. If they couldn't, you know, find a use for it, they threw it out. Yes, please. Yes, that's, I mentioned my grandfather. He used to take me there when it was, what's the tire dealer that was there? That's the one, thank you. And Kaiser Frazer, that was a real good example of another one of those post-war auto companies that just kind of flowered into bloom. They built them at the old bomber factory, the Willow Run bomber factory in Detroit. Okay. I just remember when it was still a Studebaker, because when I remember the Avanti dealership was up here on Wick Avenue, almost to Ursuline.
Right. Did you see in the brick building up there? There was a red brick wheel, and it was a Studebaker. It was part of the building, I guess.
Sure, that's one of those things that always fascinates me. These buildings. You know, you get a glimpse at what they used to be. There's an old Chevy dealer down the street from me in Elyria, and it's got the Chevrolet bow tie, and you know there's a building right as you're coming off 90 onto Chester Avenue that's got Cadillac emblems on it, and there's actually a building on Carnegie Avenue in Cleveland that has a big terracotta wheel in it, and it says Pierce Arrow on it.
And then something else. Somewhere along the line there, someone said that they were Sears and Roebuck was selling the car catalog. It goes back to after the 1900s.
Yes, that's true. That's you could buy.
The parts were made in North Line.
Okay.
I never. That George Reese you talked about. I used to talk to him maybe once or twice a month at the Strauss's coffee shop, and I'm sure it was he who brought that up. I've never read it though. He said that they made the Sears and Roebuck catalog car out there in North Line.
Sears and Roebuck, you could buy anything through the Sears catalog. They used to sell prefabricated houses as well.
Wasn't the DeLorean built in Youngstown close to Ursuline, or just was there a place where you could buy them?
It was probably a dealership. The DeLoreans were actually built in Northern Ireland. And it was Northern Ireland in the 1980s, so things were blowing up there at that time. And it was one of those things that DeLorean is actually regarded like a con artist in the British Isles because he took all these tax abatements to build them there. But his brother actually had a General Motors dealership somewhere in the Cleveland area.
Cadillac.
I'm sorry?
It was Cadillac.
Okay, it was a Cadillac dealership. All right.
Just one more thing. In the late 30s, Chrysler came out with the engine in the, was it in the back? Front, and McGuire had a dealership up on Market Street. And this new model did the soda.
The airflow.
Yeah, the air, that's right, the airflow. And everyone's kidding, you don't know whether that car's going front or back.
Mm-hmm.
Great history.
All right. Well, I thank you for being such an attentive audience.